corners of Hogwarts, the castle keeps even from itself. Long before the moving staircases learned their places, one of its founders went down into the dark beneath the foundations and told no one what he was building. The first stone beneath the eastern tower moved only when Salazar laid 3 fingers against its lower edge and spoke in parcel tongue. There was no hinge in the mortar, no handle to break the smooth face of the wall, yet the block drew inward with a faint grinding, opening upon a stair so narrow his shoulders nearly brushed both sides as he went down. Above him Hogwarts still rang with hammers. The sound came strangely through the foundations, each blow softened by earth and layers of newly joined stone, as though some patient giant were knocking from a great distance. Salazar sealed the entrance behind him, raised his wand, and continued down by its pale green light. Moisture shone along the steps. The masons believed this part of the hill was solid rock, unsuitable for cellars, too deep for drains, and they believed it because he had told them so. At the foot of the stair stood a round chamber no larger than a village chapel, its walls unfinished and marked with fresh cuts. A carved serpent wound around the central pillar, though its eyes were still blank hollows, and its scales gave out halfway down the stone. Behind an iron grill beyond it, something shifted among the shadows, with the dry sound of leather drawn across sand. Salazar stopped outside the bars. "You have grown," he said. 2 dim points opened low to the ground. They did not shine like a cat's eyes. Instead, they gathered the wand light and held it without warmth. A long shape moved behind the grill, pale where its skin passed close to the bars, then slid back into the hollow beyond. Food lay untouched on a stone slab near the entrance. 3 plucked hens with their feathers gathered neatly in a basket. He looked them over, then turned his head towards the darkness. "You will eat when you choose. You will sleep when I command, and you will remain silent." A whisper answered, too soft to carry beyond the chamber, the language slipping through the cold room with a sibilance no human throat could have mistaken for speech. He listened without moving, one hand resting lightly on the head of his cane. "Yes," he replied, "there are others above." The creature's body settled with a slow scrape, and somewhere behind the grill stone gave a small click beneath its weight. Salazar crossed to the pillar and set his wand against an unfinished scale. It was a delicate charm meant to draw the moisture from the stone and close the smallest cracks before winter widened them, the sort of magic Rowena admired because it left no visible seam. Under his hand, the carved scale darkened, hardened, and became indistinguishable from work completed months before. A second charm muffled the chamber. A third altered the stair. Anyone forcing open the concealed block above would now find only 6 steps ending in packed earth. He had tested the deception himself from every angle. The false soil smelled of damp roots. It crumbled beneath a boot, and even a probing spell returned the dull resistance of the hillside. Only Parseltongue opened the true descent. He had just begun work upon the serpent's empty eyes when a sound reached him from above. 3 knocks coming through the concealed entrance, measured and distinct. Salazar lowered his wand. For several seconds he watched the stone ceiling, counting the space between each knock. No mason used that rhythm. Laborers shouted before entering a closed passage, and pupils had learned quickly that the unfinished eastern corridors were forbidden. The knocking came again, and after it a woman's voice, blurred by layers of rock. Salazar? Rowena? Behind the grill, the young basilisk stirred. Quiet, he whispered, and the scraping ceased. He drew his wand down the front of his robes. Gray dust lifted from the fabric, gathered into a thin coil, and settled over his boots. Another motion roughened the cuffs of his sleeves and left a fresh white mark across one shoulder. By the time he climbed the stair, he had the look of a man, interrupted while inspecting the lower masonry. The false landing folded away before him, and the stone block opened. Rowena Ravenclaw stood in the passage with a brass lamp in one hand and a roll of parchment tucked beneath her arm. Her dark hair had escaped its pins in two places, as it often did when she had spent too long among measurements. She looked first at him, then past him to the narrow black stair. "I wondered whether you had fallen through the floor," she said. "A disappointment to you, I'm sure. An inconvenience. We should have to rename several rooms." Her mouth curved, though her attention stayed on the darkness behind him. Salazar stepped into the corridor and let the stone begin closing at his back, and her eyes followed the seams until they disappeared. "What is down there?" she asked. "A failed foundation. That sounds unlike you." Even the hill is permitted one mistake. The block settled flush with the wall. Rowena lifted the lamp closer to study the mortar. Its flame showed every ridge left by the trowel, every dull fleck of grit. Nothing marked the entrance except a line so slight it might have been a natural flaw. She reached towards it, and Salazar put his hand against the wall before her fingers touched the stone. "It is unstable." Her hand stopped beside his. "Then why were you standing beneath it?" "I know where the weight rests." "So do I." "You know where it ought to rest." For the first time, her gaze left the wall. The lamplight caught the small silver threads beginning at her temples, though she was still young enough to resent anyone noticing them. She lowered her hand, not quickly, and drew the parchment from beneath her arm. "The western roof has shifted 1/2 inch, she said. "Godric insists the beams are sound. Helga insists the rain is at fault. I insist that both of them are exhausting. That is usually the safest conclusion. I came to ask whether you would look. You came 3 floors down and crossed an unfinished wing to ask about a roof on the opposite side of the castle? I had already looked in your chamber." He met her eyes. She gave the parchment a small tap against her palm. "Your door was open." "A servant must have left it so." "We have no servants in this wing." "A pupil, then." "No pupils are permitted here." "Your talent for removing possibilities remains impressive, and yours for supplying them has improved." A hammer struck somewhere overhead. Dust loosened from a joint in the ceiling and drifted through the light between them, and Salazar brushed it from Rowena's sleeve with 2 fingers, an old gesture from before either of them had learned to distrust small kindnesses. "Show me the roof," he said. She did not move at once. From behind the sealed stone came a sound no louder than a fingernail drawn once across wood, and Rowena turned her head. Salazar bent to pick up the lamp she had nearly lowered against the wall. "The new pipes," he said. "Helga had them laid too close to the outer stone." "There's no water in this wing yet." Then perhaps the castle is learning to complain before she gives it cause. That earned the beginning of a laugh. It faded when Rowena looked again at the wall, but the moment had passed. He handed back the lamp and walked beside her towards the stair. They climbed in silence until the hammering grew loud enough to become ordinary. At the first landing, daylight reached through a window that had no glass and spread across piles of timber, ropes, and chipped stone. Two boys in plain school robes hurried past, carrying a box of iron nails between them, arguing over whether the moving staircases had been Godric's idea, or an accident no one wished to admit. Rowena watched them go. "They should not be in this wing," she said. "No. You said a pupil may have opened your door." "So I did." Her fingers tightened a little around the rolled parchment. "Which pupil?" Salazar looked towards the open window where a rook had landed on the unfinished sill. Its claws clicked against the stone. Beyond it, the ground sloped down through wet grass to the dark edge of the forest. "A narrow-faced Hufflepuff boy," he said. "First year, red hair. He fled before I could ask his name." "Oswin Folly?" "Perhaps. He is afraid of staircases." A sensible trait in this castle. Rowena climbed on. Her pace had not altered, yet she was no longer at his side. One step of empty air opened between them, then a second, and above them Hogwarts went about its noise. Saws biting into wood, children calling to one another down the bare corridors, Helga laughing somewhere out in the courtyard, Godric's voice lifted in some cheerful quarrel with a mason. Salazar came on at precisely the distance she had left him. And far beneath, behind stone and false earth and a door without a seam, the creature shifted once, then held still. Rain had found its way through the temporary roof above the kitchens and dripped, slow and patient, into 3 copper bowls. Helga had set them out herself, waving off 2 older pupils who offered, and now every drop rang a different note according to the water beneath it. Sleeves rolled above the elbow, she stood at the long preparation table cutting the bruised flesh from good apples while Salazar mended a cracked lintel over the pantry door. "You've made that too neat," she said. "The lintel?" "The lie." His wand paused against the stone, and he asked which one. She dropped another brown apple into the waste basket, set its good half aside, and told him. "The boy in the eastern wing." "Rowena asked Oswin Folly whether he had been near your rooms. He wept so hard I had to give him honey and warm milk. An extravagant remedy for innocence. He is 12. At 12 I could lie without refreshments. That is because you were a dreadful child." A turn of his wrist sealed the last crack. The fractured stone drew itself together until only a pale vein remained, fine as thread beneath the surface, and Helga watched the whole of it before nudging a clean cloth towards him for the mortar dust on his fingers. She had always kept useful things within reach: cloths, bread, keys, names, the exact knowledge of who had gone short at supper. Beyond the high windows, the rain blurred the courtyard scaffolds. A mason went hurrying across the mud with a plank balanced over his head, and 2 girls pressed their faces to the glass to watch him lose a shoe to it. Their laughter tugged Helga's mouth into a smile before she turned back to the fruit. "Rowena thinks Oswin was covering for someone," she said. "Rowena thinks locked doors are personal insults." "And you?" "I think she should leave frightened boys alone." The knife stopped halfway through an apple. That, Helga said, was nearly kind. And he told her not to repeat it. She began cutting again, slower now. There is a door beneath the north passage. Small one, oak, iron-bound. It was locked last week. He folded the cloth once before he set it down and observed that most doors improved with practice. This one was open this morning. The rain came against the roof in a sudden, hard rush. Water spilled over the lip of one copper bowl and ran across the flagstones in a thin, bright line. Helga kept her eyes on him the whole way as she crossed the room, lifted the bowl, and tipped half of it into the wash sink. I went through, she said, and found steps. He allowed that many doors had them. Downward, she said. That, he told her, narrowed the matter. Her brows rose. You have become tiresome since spring. I have been told it suits me. It does not. For a moment the preparation table stood between them, apples ranged in their careful rows, the rain ticking into metal. Helga took the key ring at her waist and turned it until one long black key lay across her palm. Salazar knew it at once. He had copied it 3 months before and had the original back in its place before sunrise. The door belongs to your section, she said, or did when we drew the plans. Plans alter. Not without Rowena writing 6 pages about it. That may explain why I chose silence. Her mouth tightened, though her voice stayed soft, and she said she'd called down, and something had answered. Behind his stillness, a dozen possibilities fell into order. The young basilisk could not reach the northern stair. The tunnels did not yet join. But sound traveled through unfinished foundations in ways that defeated even Rowena's calculations. What sort of answer? A scrape, then another. She set the key on the table between them, large enough that I did not go farther. You did well. I did not ask whether I had done well. I asked you to tell me what I heard. She waited. Salazar went to the nearest copper bowl and moved it beneath a fresh leak where the new drop struck the center with a bright, hollow note. The lower galleries, he told her, were being widened for winter stores. A cart axle had been left against the wall, and water shifted old timber. There were no cart marks. Then the axle was carried. No mud on the steps. The workmen cleaned their boots. Helga looked towards the pantry, where 3 sacks of flour leaned against the wall, dusted white at their bases. You do not even enjoy these answers. Enjoyment has never been required. That is what troubles me. Then the kitchen door swung open, and Godric came in backwards under a wet timber beam balanced on one shoulder, 2 pupils trailing after him, each pretending to help while chiefly trying not to be crushed. He lowered the beam onto the trestles, shook the rain out of his hair, and grinned at the sight of Salazar. Rowena, he announced, claimed Salazar had stolen half the castle's lower passages. Helga claimed the roof was losing a war with the weather, and he himself claimed breakfast had been postponed long enough. No one claims that, Helga said. I do. You ate twice? Construction requires courage. It requires porridge. The pupils laughed. Godric winked at them, and Helga pointed sternly at the door so that they fled before she could set them to work. Salazar watched him cross to the apple table, take one from the good pile, and stop at the sight of the black key. What is that? A door Salazar forgot to mention, Helga said. Godric bit into the apple and chewed, his eyes staying on Salazar the while. Had he? Salazar asked. That depended, Godric said around the apple. Where did it lead? To unfinished storage, Salazar told him. Helga had heard something beneath it. Timber shifting, Salazar said. Godric swallowed. Timber does not breathe. Around the three of them, the kitchen drew smaller, close with damp wool and rainwater and apple peel and the smell of hot iron off the banked ovens. Helga's eyes went down to the key. Godric took another bite, but the ease had gone out of it. I heard no breathing, she said at last. He glanced at her. A scrape, she went on, only that. He set the apple down and said that they would look together then. Salazar reached for the key before either of them stirred. The black iron was cold from Helga's palm. Tomorrow, he said, when the rain has stopped and the lower steps are less likely to collapse beneath all that courage. Godric laughed under his breath, though his hand stayed on the table beside the apple. Tomorrow, then. That night Salazar went back alone to the north passage and sealed the little oak door from the far side come morning. The stair behind it ended after 9 steps against a wall of ancient bedrock, rough and wet and solid under every spell Godric knew. Deeper down, past 2 turns and a shaft no human body could enter, a pale coil slid through the dark, while Salazar whispered to it until it settled once more. Morning came with a hard white sky and frost. Along the unfinished parapets, the rain had stopped, though water still crept down the inner walls in narrow threads and pooled beneath the windows. Godric arrived at the north passage with 2 lanterns, a coil of rope, and a short-handled hammer. As though Helga had invited him to inspect a dragon's den, Rowena came behind him bearing parchment chalk and an expression that seemed braced for the very stones to contradict her. Salazar stood waiting at the oak door already. You are early, Godric said. You are armed against masonry. One never knows what masonry has been told. Helga gave him a look and took one of the lanterns from his hand. Over her work dress she wore a thick brown cloak, a basket hooked on one arm, bread, solve, candles, and a flask of something hot showing beneath the cloth. For Helga met danger by supposing it might turn out hungry or cold. The black key went into the lock without resistance. Salazar turned it once, drew the door inward, and held his lantern over the descending steps, where damp rock shone below. 9 stairs, and then a wall that looked to have stood under the hill since before any of them had names. Godric leaned past him. That was not there yesterday. You did not come yesterday. Helga did. Helga stepped down first, one hand against the wall. At the bottom, she pressed her fingers to the bedrock, then knocked twice with the hilt of the key. Dull, close, no cavity answering. This was open farther, she said. Memory is generous in poor light, Salazar replied. Her thumb moved across the rough stone and came away smeared with gray grit, fresh and powdery. She studied it, rolled it between finger and thumb, and looked toward Salazar without a word. Rowena descended more carefully, counting each stair under her breath. At the wall, she raised her wand and traced a square through the air. A pale lattice spread over the rock, sank into it, and returned in wavering lines. Solid, Godric said. For 12 feet, Rowena answered. Then the spell bends. Salazar watched the pattern reflected in her eyes. He had expected the test, though not this particular variation. Rowena had altered the common probing charm so that it measured magical resistance rather than empty space. The false bedrock would hold against force, touch, and sound, but its making lay folded around the hidden passage like fabric around a blade. Moisture, he said. The hill is saturated after the rain. The western foundations are wetter. The western foundations are shallower. So the plans say. At that, Godric turned towards him, lantern held low. The light carved deep shadows beneath his brow and caught the gold thread at the edge of his red cloak. He said nothing, which Salazar found more troublesome than any accusation. Rowena ran the spell again, and this time the lattice tightened, each line fine as a strand of hair. Halfway through the rock, one corner warped sharply downwards. "There," she said. "A fault in the stone," Salazar replied. "A right-angled fault?" Nature occasionally disappoints geometry. Nature does not usually conceal its mistakes behind new mortar. Her wand tip moved towards the upper edge of the wall. Salazar stepped close enough that his sleeve brushed hers, then set 2 fingers against a shallow crack beside the door frame. The passage gave a soft groan. Dust spilled from the ceiling, and Godric seized Helga by the shoulder and pulled her back as a fist-sized fragment of stone struck the 7th step. Rowena's spell broke apart in a shower of pale sparks. "Out," Salazar said. No one argued. They climbed into the passage while smaller chips rattled behind them, and Salazar shut the oak door as another low complaint traveled through the wall. That sound, at least, was genuine. During the night, he had weakened an abandoned support shaft beside the false passage, leaving it stable unless Rowena used sustained revealing magic. Godric stared at the door. "You knew that would happen. I knew the lower masonry was unsafe. You did not warn us about a collapse. I warned you about the steps. That is a narrow distinction. Narrow distinctions keep buildings standing." Helga brushed dust from the shoulder Godric had gripped. Her hand trembled once as she fastened the clasp of her cloak, then steadied. "No one goes below again until the masons inspect it," she said. "That includes you, Salazar." He inclined his head. "Of course." Rowena, meanwhile, was looking at the fragment Godric had carried up on his boot. She crouched, picked it from the floor, and turned it beneath the lantern. One side was dark with age. The other showed a fresh line where a tool had cut into it. "You carved the support," she said. Salazar glanced at the stone. "The masons carved half this hill." "Recently?" "Everything here is recent." Her eyes lifted to his face. The old ease between them had once let silences stay harmless. This one sharpened while Godric shifted his grip on the lantern, and Helga stood with the basket pressed against her hip. At last, Salazar reached into his sleeve and drew out a narrow brass measuring pin. "I tested the joint before you arrived," he said. "It moved. I intended to brace it after breakfast." "You intended to let us enter first?" Godric asked. "I intended to prevent Rowena from dismantling a wall before I understood what held it up." That answer might have served before the ceiling came down. It still serves. Godric's jaw worked as though he had bitten on something hard. Helga opened her basket, removed the flask, and poured steaming spiced milk into its little silver cup, which she gave to Rowena, who took it without shifting her gaze from Salazar. "We should have believed you yesterday," Helga said quietly. "You might have made that easier." Salazar slid the measuring pin back inside his sleeve. "Belief that requires ease is of little value." Rowena's fingers closed around the warm cup. "That sounds like something spoken by a man who has stopped expecting friendship." The masons came before noon and found the lower wall sealed by a shift in the hillside. By evening, Godric had ordered the oak door boarded over, Helga had moved her stores elsewhere, and Rowena had taken the fresh-cut stone to her chamber. Far beneath their feet, Salazar opened another way down and found the basilisk lying beside the unfinished pillar, its pale head resting between its coils, one lidless eye kept hidden against the floor. By the time the first snow gathered in the angles of the courtyard, Rowena had stopped bringing her plants to supper. The change announced itself through absence. No longer did her rolls of parchment crowd the table between the bread and the salt. No ink stained the side of her hand when she reached for wine. She listened while Godric described a staircase that had deposited 3 pupils inside a linen cupboard, and while Helga argued that the castle could not be considered properly inhabited until the kitchens had a second oven. Salazar noticed that Rowena laughed in the correct places and never once asked his opinion. Above them, the great hall stood open to the rafters. Snow sifted through gaps in the temporary roof and vanished before it reached the long table caught by Helga's warming charms. Candle stubs floated in uneven rows, their wax dripping upwards towards the beams. Too large still for the few pupils gathered at its far end, the room returned every voice from the stone a moment after it was spoken. "You have lost her," Godric said when Helga rose to carry a tray of baked pears to the younger children. Salazar cut the rind from a piece of cheese. "She is sitting 6 feet away." "You know what I mean." "Rarely." Godric leaned back, stretching one arm along the bench. He had tied his hair at the nape against the draft, though several red strands had escaped and curled damply around his temples. Across the table, Rowena turned a page in a small book she had not been reading for the last quarter of an hour. "What did you do?" Godric asked. "Nothing she cannot forgive." That was not the question. It is the more useful answer. A pupil came up to ask Helga whether the pears contained nutmeg, and the interruption drew her away from the table again. Rowena closed the book upon one finger, looking at neither man. "Ask me directly, Godric," she said. Godric's mouth shifted. "I was trying to be tactful. You were trying to be quiet. There is a difference. Only to those who manage one of them." Salazar laid the cheese knife beside his plate. Rowena opened the book again, her fingers still between the same pages. The title, in faded Latin, concerned load-bearing arches in Roman bathhouses. Godric lowered his voice. "You found something in the stone?" "I found a cut made recently." And Salazar says the masons made it." "They may have." At last, Rowena looked up at him. "You told Helga that you made it while testing the support." Salazar rested his hand around the stem of his cup. "I told you that I tested the joint." "You showed us the instrument." "Yes." "You allowed us to infer the rest." "Inference is your preferred form of travel." A few pupils laughed at something near the hearth. The sound rose warmly, then thinned, as it crossed the unfinished hall. Rowena set the book flat upon the table. "Come to my chamber after supper," she said. Godric glanced between them. "Am I invited?" "No." "Helga?" "No." "That seems unwise. So does discussing foundation magic beside 12 children in a pudding." Helga returned carrying the empty tray. "What have I missed?" "Rowena's kidnapping Salazar," Godric said. "After supper?" "So she claims." "Take a cloak," Helga told Salazar. "The western corridor has no windows yet." For a moment the old rhythm of their talk stirred, worn smooth by years of shared roads and bad lodgings. Godric reached for a pear Helga had kept back, and she slapped his knuckles with the serving spoon. Rowena's mouth twitched before she turned away. Salazar watched the expression disappear. Her chamber occupied a half-finished tower above the library, the walls curving around shelves not yet filled. Drawings covered the central table and climbed the stone behind it, held there by brass pins and small blue flames. Some showed the foundations as the masons knew them. Others carried Rowena's private corrections in a hand so fine that whole passages fitted between two ordinary lines. She closed the door after him and sealed it without a word. On the table lay the fragment from the North Passage, and beside it rested 3 older plans. "I drew these before the first stone was set," Rowena said. "This one shows the slope of the hill. This one, the natural faults beneath the northern side, and this one, every cavity we found while cutting the lower foundations." Salazar removed his gloves finger by finger. "You have always been thorough." He said it lightly, but she did not let the compliment carry her off course. There had been no stair, she told him, no space for one. He answered that there was no stair now, and that her survey had been incomplete. Her survey, she said, had been correct. The blue flames along the wall bent as wind pressed against the unfinished shutters. Rowena crossed to one of the plans and touched a narrow strip beneath the eastern tower, a strip erased and redrawn several times over. This measurement changed in August by 4 feet. The foundation settled. Stone settles downwards. The hill shifted. Sideways? "You have seen stranger behavior from this castle." "From the castle, yes." And she let the words rest there. Salazar laid his gloves beside the fragment and looked over the drawings with real admiration. Few living witches or wizards could have reconstructed the concealed alterations from such small irregularities. Fewer still would have caught them before the work was even finished. "You want an explanation?" he said. "I want the truth. You have never accepted the first when the second sounded grander." She drew a fresh sheet from beneath the others. On it she had mapped the eastern foundations from memory, and a blank space remained at the center, narrow at the top and widening below. "What," she asked, "was there?" "Rock," he told her. "What kind?" "Dark," he said, cold, uninterested in argument. Her palm came down over the parchment. "Do not do this." She said it quietly enough that the nearest flame seemed to waver, louder than her voice. Salazar looked at her hand. Ink marked the side of her smallest finger after all, a thin blue line she had missed while washing. Years earlier, in a rain-soaked room above a York tavern, she'd fallen asleep over a page of calculations and left the same stain across his sleeve. He had kept the robe until the wool wore through at the cuffs. "What would satisfy you?" he asked. Let me see it. No. The answer altered her face by very little. Her fingers lifted from the drawing, leaving 4 faint crescents in the parchment, and she said that then there was something after all. There were matters in this school, he replied, that did not require her inspection. She asked him to name one. His thoughts, he said. Those, she reminded him, had never stayed private for long. Perhaps he had learned better habits. Rowena turned away and moved one of the blue flames closer to the wall. Its light passed over notes in Salazar's own hand, copied from records he had assumed she no longer possessed. She had gathered every alteration, every sealed corridor, and every missing measure into one place. You asked me once, she said, to design a school where no child would be turned away for lacking a proper roof over his head. I remember. You said stone should hide nothing from those who lived within it. I was younger. You were kinder. Salazar took up his gloves. Kindness is Helga's department. We divided the work sensibly. That used to amuse me. It may again. No, there was no heat in it. Rowena unsealed the door and opened it onto the dark corridor where snow had blown through the window arches and lay in pale strips along the floor. At the threshold, Salazar paused. Would she tell the others? She had not decided. That meant, he said, that she would tell Helga first, and her hand tightened on the iron latch. You always did know us well, she said. He stepped into the corridor. That is why I know what to conceal. And the door closed behind him. Later, beneath the eastern tower, he took the last copy plan from its hiding place and fed it to a green flame until the measurements curled black and vanished. Behind the iron grill, something pale shifted deeper into the dark, and the unfinished serpent on the pillar watched with empty stone eyes. Helga found him in the herb room 3 weeks later, trimming the roots from a tray of sleeping nettles. Frost had whitened the inside of the narrow windows, and the shelves smelled of damp soil, of mint, of the sharp medicinal sweetness of crushed dittany. He worked with a small silver knife, setting each clean root into a blue glazed jar while the severed ends curled slowly on the board. You've moved the lower stores again, Helga said. The flour was spoiling. The flour was dry. The room was not, he answered, and she closed the door with her heel. A woolen shawl covered her hair and shoulders, still dusted with snow from the courtyard, and she carried a wooden box against her chest. When she set it down, the latch sprang open on a row of iron nails, each bent almost double. These came from the boards over the north door, she said. Salazar scraped a thread of black earth from the blade. Poor iron. Godric chose them. Poor judgment, then. They were pulled from the inside. The sleeping nettles stirred beneath his hand, their pale leaves folding tighter as if to shrink from the light. He set the knife beside the jar and examined the nails without touching them. Fine scratches ran along their shafts where metal had dragged through oak, and the heads were flattened in a way no hammer could have managed from the passage. Wood contracts in cold weather, he said. Wood does not put nails in a box. You did that? After I found them laid in a row on the step. Salazar looked up. Helga stood with both hands on the edge of the table, her fingers red from the cold, one thumb pressing again and again at a shallow cut in the wood. She had not brought her key ring. Who else knew? He asked. No one. Why? Because she had wanted to hear him answer before Godric did. That, he said, was unusually cautious of her. It was, she said, unusually necessary. A branch scraped the outer wall, softened by the thick stone. Somewhere beyond the door, pupils crossed the adjoining corridor with baskets bound for the kitchens, their voices rising and fading between bursts of laughter, and Helga waited until they had passed. I went down alone, she said. The door was sealed. The boards were on the floor. And the wall? Still there. Salazar lifted one of the nails. Its iron had kept a trace of magic, thin and greasy against his fingertips. The basilisk could not have reached the door, and yet something from below had traveled along the binding charm and worried at the weakest point. Hunger, perhaps, or irritation at the winter cold. What did you hear? He asked. Nothing. That should reassure you. It did. The reply came too quickly. He set the nail down and folded his hands upon the table. Then why, he asked, was she here? Because the silence had stopped, she said, when she spoke his name. The sleeping nettles opened by a fraction, disturbed by the warmth of her breath. She reached into her pocket and brought out a strip of shed skin, no longer than her finger, colorless and thin as onion membrane, a faint pattern of scales pressed into its surface. I found this caught beneath the lowest board. Salazar did not reach for it. A snake. In winter? Stone holds heat. Not that passage. Then it traveled from somewhere warmer. She laid the skin beside the bent nails. Once she reminded him he had told her there were no serpents living beneath the school. He might, he allowed, have been mistaken. She observed that he disliked mistakes. He disliked admitting them, he corrected, and she said that this at least was true. The faintest smile touched her mouth, and then left it. Salazar remembered the first winter they had traveled together, when Helga had slept in a chair beside his sick bed for 2 nights and pretended each morning that she had merely been sorting herbs. She'd never asked to be thanked. She had only complained that he was ungrateful enough to survive. "Come away with me," she said. The words entered the room gently. Salazar glanced towards the shelves. Where? Upstairs to the hall. Godric is teaching the older pupils to duel without setting fire to their sleeves, and Rowena is pretending she has no opinion on his method. Helga nudged the wooden box aside. Sit with us, eat something, argue about the timetable until it becomes ordinary again. Ordinary things are often the most dangerous, Salazar said. She answered without looking up. Only to people determined to spoil them. On the cutting board, a root gave a small twitch. He took up the silver knife and trimmed its end away with one precise stroke, and only then remarked that she had not told them about the skin. No. Will you? That depends on whether you come upstairs. The knife stayed motionless between his fingers. She'd made the invitation sound like nothing at all, yet both of them knew its true shape. Except, and there would be questions, then explanations, then hands and wands, searching beneath the school until every piece of his careful work lay open to their scrutiny. He said as much, in his own fashion, calling it silence offered in exchange for company. I am offering trust before I run out of it, she said. Trust with a price is merely purchase. Her thumb had been pressing at the cut in the table. It stopped. She told him he had grown very skilled at finding ugly names for kindness, and he said that names mattered. Yes, Helga let the word rest a moment. That is why I used yours below. For several breaths there was nothing but a single drop of water falling into the basin under the window. Salazar laid the knife beside the nettles and brushed the soil from his cuffs, and something in Helga's shoulders eased. Then he closed the wooden box and said he had work. The softness left her face, though no anger came in behind it. She folded the strip of skin into a square of linen and slipped it into her pocket, leaving the bent nails where they lay. At the door she paused, one hand on the latch, and looked back along the shelf at the jars ranged there in their neat row. I shall tell them tonight, she said. He had already chosen another route. I know. The door she left half open. Cold corridor air came in across the herb room and moved over the table, stirring the pale leaves one after another. By evening, the skin would be in Rowena's hands and the nails set before Godric. But Helga would no longer be standing between him and the rest of their suspicion. He waited until her footsteps had gone entirely, and then he took the bent nails below. In the hidden chamber, he widened the outer ring of wards and sealed every passage save the one that answered to his voice. Beyond the grill, the basilisk lay coiled against the far wall, its shed skin hanging from the stone in torn, translucent ribbons. One great curve of its body rose and fell in the dark as he worked. When he spoke its name, the slow movement stopped. Godric chose the old solar, partly because its hearth drew properly, and partly because none of the pupils had yet found the loose panel behind the window seat. The four of them had once spent whole evenings in that room, passing a single bottle between them while Rowena corrected the castle plans and Helga mended robes that no one would own to. Tonight the bottle stood on the table unopened. Salazar came in last and found the serpent skin laid out beside it on a square of white linen. You took your time, Godric said. I was teaching. At this hour? Some pupils require longer than others. By the hearth sat Rowena, a ledger closed across her knees. Helga had the window seat, though she had turned from the glass and folded her hands away inside her sleeves. No one had claimed the high-backed chair opposite the fire, the one Salazar generally preferred. He crossed to it and sat without asking. Godric stayed on his feet. He said Helga had found the skin beneath the north passage, so she told me, Salazar answered, and that she had told them a good deal more than that besides. There was little point repeating it then, Salazar said. There was every point, Godric said back. Firelight ran along the sword at Godric's belt, though his hand was nowhere near the hilt. He wore the thing at supper, through lessons, up among the roof beams, as easily as another man carried a purse, and Salazar had watched him draw it in anger only twice, both times for someone else. Between finger and thumb, Rowena lifted the serpent's skin. Too broad for a grass snake, she said. The scales were wrong for an adder, and the membrane carried traces of preserving magic. Stone can alter what it keeps. Stone does not cast spells. No, wizards do. Godric took a single step towards the chair and asked which wizard. On the window seat, Helga shifted, and the small movement drew his eye and stopped him before the question could grow any louder. She'd set 4 cups on the sill at her side, each one filled with mulled wine. Steam still climbed off 3 of them. "I asked him to come upstairs," she said. "He refused." "That is not evidence," said Salazar. "No, it was an answer." The fire settled around a blackened log. Rowena returned the skin to its linen and opened the ledger across her knees. Its pages copies of building accounts, stone delivered from the quarry, charms laid into the foundations, all of it in her hand. 14 iron grills had been commissioned in June, she said. The masons had installed 13. "A counting error," he offered. The smith remembered making the extra one. Smiths remembered payment, he said. This one remembered the dimensions. Salazar put out a hand towards the hearth and said, "The man should be praised for his memory." Rowena turned the ledger so the figures faced him. 9 feet wide, 12 high, the bars close enough together to hold something narrow-headed and strong. Or several barrels. Behind a grill, Godric guards whine more fiercely. No one smiled. In earlier years, the remark would have earned a loud objection and Helga's spoon against the table. Now Godric only looked at the unopened bottle and asked him to say there was nothing living below. "There are rats," Salazar said, watching the flames between his fingers. "You know what I mean. I know what you wish me to say. Say it anyway." Across the room, snow brushed the shutters with a soft, granular sound. Helga got up and brought him one of the cups from the sill, setting it on the arm of his chair. She'd done the same after arguments in cottages, in monasteries, in borrowed halls. The cup held out as a bridge that none of them was ever asked to name. "What did you put beneath the school?" Rowena asked. "Foundations." "What did you place behind the missing grill?" "Nothing that concerns the pupils." It was Godric's face that changed first, the chin dropping, the line beside his mouth cutting deeper. Rowena kept still, but one hand closed on the edge of the ledger until the parchment bent under her fingers. "So there was something," Helga said. Salazar took up the cup she had brought him. The wine smelled of cloves and orange peel, made the way he liked it, because she remembered everything she thought worth remembering. He set it down again untouched and spoke of protections. The castle would outlive them all with any luck and would draw enemies to it if they succeeded, and he had prepared for possibilities the rest of them would rather not consider. "Protections do not shed skin," Godric said. "Some do?" "Show us." "No." There was no force in the word, yet Godric's hand flattened against the table as though to steady it. Rowena shut the ledger. Helga went back to the window seat and gathered the 4th cup into both hands, though she did not drink from it. They had built this place together, Godric said. No part of it belonged to any one of them alone. Then Salazar began to number the exceptions. The boundaries Godric had drawn round the training grounds, without a word to him, to stop children walking under flying arrows. The western tower Rowena had changed because the first design would have come down. The tunnels Helga ran from the kitchens to every storeroom in the castle. "They carry bread," Helga said. He looked from one face to the next and said that in that case they each kept their own arrangements. "That is a poor pretense," said Rowena. "It is the last one I intend to offer." Even Godric had nothing for that. A coal broke in the grate and threw a brief shower of sparks against the iron screen. With great care, Helga set her cup down on the sill. "You mean to stop explaining," she said. I mean to stop submitting every judgment to a council. We are not a council, Godric said. No, you were friends. Rowena's eyes came to him. Were? The question had been waiting weeks, perhaps far longer. He might have softened the answer or put it off, or buried it under some other grievance. Instead, he lifted the serpent skin from the linen and folded it once along the line of its scales and told them that friendship did not grant ownership. Godric drew a slow breath in through his nose. No one here was trying to own him. You are searching my work, Salazar said, questioning tradesmen, opening doors assigned to me. Because you lie. Because you no longer trust me. You have given us reason, and now you have given me reason to keep my distance. Helga kept her gaze on her folded hands. With the ledger tucked under one arm, Rowena rose from the chair and held out her palm for the skin, and Salazar gave it back to her. We shall inspect the foundations, she said. He told her she would find stone. She answered that they would inspect them all, and he warned her she would waste the winter on it. Godric crossed to the door and opened it without a word of dismissal. He did not order Salazar out. The omission carried more weight than any command could have. Salazar paused at the threshold beside Helga. Her cup stood untouched on the sill, its surface dark and unmoving. He might have said her name and she might have raised her eyes to him. He left the room without doing either. Below the castle, the basilisk lay behind the iron grille, while he erased the last traces of its outer passage from every plan that survived. By dawn, the hidden chamber belonged to no account, no measurement, no shared memory, and the loose panel behind the Solar's window seat stood open on an empty hollow. They began the inspection on the first clear morning after Candlemas. Rowena arrived with chalk, measuring rods, and 3 pupils, old enough to record figures without asking what they meant. Salazar noticed at once that Godric carried no sword. Helga came with a ring of keys and a basket of oat cakes wrapped in linen, and they met beneath the western stair, where the walls sweated cold despite the pale sun beyond the narrow windows. No pupils below the 2nd level, Salazar said. Rowena handed a measuring rod to a tall Ravenclaw girl and said the children would remain where she placed them. He pressed her on it, warning that the lower passages were unstable, and she agreed dryly that they had been told so repeatedly. Godric took the basket from Helga and passed it to one of the pupils. Wait in the old classroom. Record nothing unless Rowena asks, eat nothing unless Helga permits, and open no doors even if the door introduces itself politely. The children withdrew with solemn faces, though one was smiling before they reached the corner. Helga watched them go, then fitted the first key to the western service door. For 2 hours, the 4 of them walked the buried edges of their school, examining drains and storerooms and unfinished classrooms where frost had furred the stones white. Rowena measured every wall twice and marked each junction with a small blue cross. Godric shouldered doors that already swung open freely. Helga ran her fingertips over hinges and mortar as though taking the castle's pulse. Salazar answered every question. His replies were concise, accurate, and useless. The sealed passage beside the old well had been abandoned to groundwater. The narrow shaft below the library had once carried smoke from a temporary furnace, and the 3 missing feet beneath the eastern gallery came down to an error in the quarryman's figures. Rowena wrote each explanation in the margin and disputed none of it. At noon, they stopped in a circular room beneath the first tower, where 4 seats had been cut straight from the wall. It had been meant as a private meeting place before the great hall was roofed, and small traces of those early days lingered. A wax stain marked Godric's seat. Helga's initials, disguised as a mason's sign, had been scratched beneath hers. And above Rowena's place, Salazar had once charmed a crack into the shape of a crooked crown after she declared herself queen of the building plans. Helga unpacked the oat cakes on the central stone and remarked that they had not eaten here since autumn. September, Rowena said. She remembered the date, she added, because Salazar had complained about the honey. It had crystallized. Godric broke a cake in half and held part of it out to Salazar. The gesture was so familiar that Salazar nearly took it without thinking. Then Godric's eyes moved to the wall behind him, settling where a shallow arch had been filled with darker stone. What was there? He asked. Salazar said nothing had been there. Godric said there had been an opening. Salazar corrected him, a recess, and pressed on what for offered a single word. Tools. Godric lowered the cake and observed that Rowena's first plan showed no recess there. She had no plan for this chamber at all. When it was cut, Salazar said. Rowena crossed to the filled arch and brushed a stroke of blue chalk across its center. The stone is 6 months newer than the wall. When he said that confirmed his answer, she shook her head. Only the date, she told him. Helga stayed by the food, tearing one cake into smaller and smaller pieces without eating any of it. Godric pressed his palm flat against the sealed arch. Salazar had closed that route in November, filled the space behind it with rubble, and turned the true passage downward before it reached the hidden stair. And no spell short of dismantling the wall would expose more than 4 feet of broken stone. Open it, Godric said. There was nothing to open, Salazar answered. Godric told him to remove the stone, and Salazar warned it would weaken the tower. Godric only looked to Rowena, who said it would hold if they braced the upper course. Salazar looked at her. She had already drawn her wand, though she held it lowered against her skirt. There had been a time when a glance between them settled such things, each of them reading exactly where the other's caution ended and curiosity began. Now she stood waiting for him to refuse aloud. No, he said. Godric kept his hand on the wall and told him he could not forbid them. Salazar reminded him who had designed the lower supports. Godric said they all had. The old grievance surfaced in short strokes. That Godric had altered his calculations twice, that they had been wrong, that they had merely been cautious, that they had been secretive. Helga set down the broken cake. Enough. The word was quiet, and yet both men stopped. She crossed the room and placed herself before the filled arch between Godric and Salazar, looking at neither. The blue chalk mark sat level with her shoulder. They would not break the wall today, she said. They would brace it properly, bring 2 masons, and open it tomorrow. Salazar studied the dark line of mortar around the newer stone. There would be no need, he told her, and when she asked why, he said it was because he would remove whatever concerned them. Tonight? Godric's expression hardened. Yes. So there was something behind it, Godric said. Records and objects that belong to him, Salazar answered. Rowena lowered her wand another inch and asked what objects. Those he had brought before Hogwarts existed, he said. She reminded him he had told them everything from those years was lost. He said only that he had allowed them to believe it. The crooked crown above her seat looked childish now, scratched into old stone by people who'd expected to grow old in one another's company. Rowena glanced at it and then away. Helga gathered the untouched cakes back into their linen, folding the cloth over them with slow, exact movements. Godric stepped aside from the arch. They would meet here at sunrise, he said, and whatever lay behind that wall would still be there. Salazar fastened his cloak at the throat. Whatever belongs to Hogwarts will remain. No one asked what he meant by the distinction. That night he emptied the recess of every harmless thing he had placed there to be found. Old family seals, correspondence in his mother's hand, 2 silver instruments, and a small chest of books on protective enchantments. Each object carried privacy enough to explain years of concealment, and truth enough to make the deception hurt. Before dawn, he laid them neatly on the chamber floor and sealed the rubble beyond with stone that had never known an opening. Far below, the basilisk shifted behind its grill as the last charm settled into place. Its body made one slow circuit of the hidden chamber, scales whispering over stone, and then its pale head vanished beneath the coils. At sunrise, frost silvered the floor of the circular chamber where the wall had been opened. Under Rowena's direction, the masons had drawn out the outer stones and stacked them in precise courses along the passage. Beyond the broken arch lay a shallow recess, choked with rubble at the back, exactly as Salazar had arranged it. His possessions stood in the center beneath 3 lanterns exposed with the stiff dignity of things laid out after a death. Godric came in first and stopped beside the small chest. Helga followed with a tray of bread and hot broth that no one had asked for. Rowena entered last, the original plan under one arm, and looked past the books and the silver instruments and the family seals to the rough stone closing the far end. "You said these were lost," she said. He answered that she had reminded him of it. Salazar stood by the entrance with his gloves in one hand. He had chosen a dark green robe without ornament and fastened his hair neatly back from his face. The room was cold enough to cloud Godric's breath, though the broth steamed between Helga's palms. Godric lifted one of the seals. A serpent had been cut into the black stone, its body looped around a crown worn smooth with the years of handling. He asked if it was his father's. "My grandfather's." Godric said he had never spoken of him, and Salazar said there was little worth saying. That, Godric replied, had never stopped any of them before. Godric set the seal down with exaggerated care, and his irritation showed in exactly that, in the way he aligned the carving precisely with the edge of the cloth beneath it. Salazar watched the thumb linger on the stone a moment longer than it needed to. Rowena lifted the lid of the chest. 6 books lay inside, wrapped in faded leather, their titles written in several different hands: protective circles, household wards, the binding of gates, the concealment of rooms from hostile eyes. Every volume was genuine. Not one of them held anything that could lead to the chamber below. "These belong to your family?" she asked. "Some. The others I acquired." Where? From people who no longer require them. Godric's head came up sharply, but Helga set the tray on the central stone before he could speak. 4 bowls stood upon it, and 4 spoons beside them, and she distributed neither yet. You kept these hidden because you feared we would take them? She asked. When he said no, she tried again. Because you feared we would judge them? Salazar's glance went to the books. You're doing so now. I am trying to understand. That has become a crowded occupation. She drew the cloth back from the bread. The loaf had been cut while still warm, and steam rose from its center. She laid a slice beside each bowl, his included, and said only, "Then help us." Rowena took out the first book and turned several pages. Notes crowded the margins, and Salazar's younger hand, angular and impatient, and a brown stain darkened one corner where rain had once come through a roof in a house none of the others had ever seen. This concealment charm, you adapted it for Hogwarts? For several walls? Which? The treasury, the records room, the lower entrances, not all of them. Her gaze drifted to the rubble at the back of the recess. Is there another way through? There was. Godric crossed the room and struck the rubble once with the heel of his hand so that loose grit sifted down between the stones. Where did it lead? To a passage abandoned during construction, one no longer there. At that he turned. You are still doing it. Doing what? Giving us enough truth to make the lie harder to name. Salazar met his eyes and answered him with 3 words. Then name it. The challenge hung there between them. Godric's hand had closed over the dust on the wall, and when it opened again, white powder lay across his knuckles. Helga pushed one of the bowls towards him. He did not notice it. Rowena carried the book to the nearest lantern. This page has been removed. Others too, by the look of it. Several, yes, by me. What was written there? Family matters, protective magic, among other things. Serpents? The word altered the room by less than a whisper. Helga stopped, tearing at the bread. Godric's attention came away from the wall. Salazar laid his gloves on the stone seat. My family used the serpent as its device. I know. Then your question is answered. She closed the book. The skin Helga found carried the same preservation pattern the binding notes describe here. That pattern is older than my family. You used it, though, often, you said. On what? Things I wish to preserve. Helga looked at the black seal beside Godric's hand. Living things? Salazar did not answer at once, and he knew what the delay would tell them, because delay could reveal as much as haste, and all 3 of them had learned his habits too well. He crossed to the tray, lifted his own bowl, took 1 measured sip of broth. Seeds, he said, rare roots, certain medicinal creatures. What creatures? Godric asked. Those requiring particular conditions. Name them? No. The spoon in Helga's hand touched the rim of her bowl, and a small clear note traveled around the chamber. Why bring us here at all? She asked. Why show us any of this, if you mean to go on speaking through a locked door? Because you intended to break the wall. We intended to find the truth. You found what I chose to keep private. That is all you are entitled to. Godric stepped back from the rubble. Entitled, he repeated, and his voice had gone very quiet. Salazar remembered him laughing through a broken tooth after their first attempt to raise the western tower, blood bright across his chin while Helga shouted at the pair of them. That man was still standing here, broader now, older about the eyes, one dusty hand hanging open at his side. "We gave you every stone in this place," Godric said. "You gave nothing that was not returned. I gave you my word, and I kept mine." "Did you?" The question landed more cleanly than any accusation would have. Salazar set down the bowl. Rowena watched him from beside the lantern, and Helga had bent her face towards the bread, though her hands had left it. Behind the rubble, beyond 4 feet of broken rock and a sealed descent that turned east, the basilisk slept beneath its layers of warded stone. "I swore to build this school," Salazar said. "I have built it." "You swore it would belong to all 4 of us," Rowena replied. "It does. Except beneath the floor." A little broth had spilled onto the tray. Helga wiped it away with the corner of the cloth, moving her hand in a slow circle until the wood was dry again. Godric took the chamber in once more, the carved seats, the crooked crown, the opened wall, and the objects laid out for them like an offering with its center missing. "Remove these by nightfall," he said. Salazar's brows lifted. "You object to their presence?" "I object to being used." The books went back into the chest one by one. Rowena wrapped each carefully before laying it down, keeping safe even what she no longer trusted, while Helga covered the bread and poured the untouched broth back into its flask. When they had gone, Salazar stayed alone among the lanterns. Their 4 bowls stood on the tray, 3 of them nearly full, and 1 marked by the touch of his mouth. Beyond the opened arch, the rubble waited in silence, rough and ordinary under the pale morning light. Spring came into Hogwarts through the unfinished windows before it ever reached the grounds. Water ran from the thawing roof in silver threads carrying soot and dust down the walls, and the corridors took on the smell of wet stone. In the great hall, the masons worked above the rafters while pupils bent over their lessons below, so used by now to fragments of mortar dropping into their ink that they scarcely looked up. By the northern hearth, Salazar taught. A row of older pupils stood before him, each with a hazel wand held over a shallow wooden bowl. Inside the bowls lay scraps of parchment marked with names, dates, and small truths their owners would rather have kept hidden. The lesson concerned concealment charms, their limits, and the danger of mistaking secrecy for protection. "Again," Salazar said. A Hufflepuff girl drew her wand too quickly. The parchment vanished, but its writing sprang up across the outside of the bowl in bright purple letters, and laughter ran along the row until his eyes turned towards it. "A secret badly concealed becomes an announcement," he said. "Miss Vale, from the first movement." At the back of the hall, beneath the gallery arch, Godric stood. He had no reason to be there, like his own pupils were training outside, and the fresh mud on his boots showed he had left them only recently. One shoulder rested against the stone while he watched Salazar guide the girl's wrist through the slower motion. "Do not fight the object," Salazar told her. "Give it somewhere else to be." The purple words faded. This time the parchment stayed visible, its surface only gone blank. "Better?" Godric was watching still when the lesson ended. Pupils gathered up their bowls and crossed the hall in chattering groups. Several thanked Salazar as they went, and one nervous boy lingered to ask whether the charm might hide a letter from his elder brother. Salazar corrected the boy's grip, set him 2 pages from a book in the library, and waited until the last robe had vanished through the doors. "You teach concealment openly now," Godric said. "I always have." "Perhaps I have only lately understood the subject." Salazar put out the practice fire with a turn of his wand, and the ash drew inward upon itself and left the grate clean and cold. Understanding often arrives after it is useful. Godric pushed away from the arch. Without his cloak, he looked less the master of half the castle and more the young swordsman who had once slept beside a roadside fire with his boots beneath his head. A leather guard covered his left forearm, split near the wrist where some pupil's spell had struck badly. "We are choosing names for the houses," he said. "So I heard. Helga wants colors as well?" "She would. Rowena has drawn 6 versions of every crest and rejected all of mine. Her judgment remains sound." One corner of Godric's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but it left a trace of the old one behind. "We need yours," he said. "You have serpents enough." Salazar gathered the wooden bowls and stacked them on the table. Around the rim of one, a hidden sentence still cast its faint shadow. He passed his thumb over the mark until it vanished. "That was not what I meant," he said. "The houses require agreement." Godric went on without pause. "Rules, which pupils go where, what each of us means to teach them. We already teach them. We gather them according to convenience, and that cannot last. Very little does." From his belt, Godric drew a folded parchment, its edges gone soft from being opened and closed too many times, and laid it beside the bowls. "Come tonight, the 4 of us. No foundations, no doors, only the school as it stands above ground." Salazar looked at the parchment without touching it and asked which children might enter. "All who have magic and need teaching." Godric's hand stayed beside the page. "Need is a generous measure. It is the only one worth using. Spoken by a man who mistakes generosity for strength." The old warmth went out of Godric's face. "There it is." "What?" "The quarrel you have been keeping ready. I have made no secret of my view. You once said blood mattered less than what a child chose to do. I said ancestry did not excuse stupidity. You said more than that. Then I was careless." High above them a hammer struck, and the blow jarred loose a little dust that came down between the 2 men and lay across the folded parchment. Godric brushed it off with the side of his hand. "My mother had no wizarding kin." "I know." "You ate at her table." "I remember. She mended your cloak after you tore it on the moor. She mended it badly." Godric gave a brief breath that might once have carried laughter. "You wore it for 5 years. It was warm. It was hers." Salazar turned towards the high windows. Beyond them the ground shone with thawed water, and the lake lay dark beneath the last strips of ice, while a group of younger pupils ran across the courtyard after a charmed hoop, slipping in the mud and hauling one another upright. "Affection does not improve blood," he said. Godric's palm flattened upon the table. "There was a time you would have been ashamed to say that in this hall. There was a time this hall had no roof. Do you hear yourself?" "Clearly." "Then come tonight," Godric said, "and say it to Helga. She knows. To Rowena. She suspects. To all of us together. Salazar faced him again and named the thing plainly. What Godric wanted was a final argument. I want you to leave yourself one road back. The words came without force. Godric folded the parchment once more, though it was already folded, and pressed the crease with his thumbnail. For a moment his whole attention rested on that small task. We cannot keep meeting you at locked doors. Then stop coming to them. Godric lifted the parchment. Tonight after supper, I shall be occupied. With what? Matters beneath your notice? The reply landed as Salazar intended. Godric's fingers tightened around the page and crushed one corner, and he looked towards the northern hearth, the empty rows of benches, the ceiling they had once planned together upon a scrap of hide. Very well. No anger entered his voice. He tucked the parchment back into his belt and walked the length of the hall without turning, and at the doors 2 pupils stepped aside to let him pass, their conversation stopping until he had gone. Salazar stayed beside the cold hearth. That evening, while voices gathered in the old solar above him, he descended beneath the eastern tower. The basilisk had outgrown the shallow hollow beyond the grille, and its pale coils now filled much of the chamber floor. It raised its head at his arrival, keeping its eyes turned towards the stone as he had taught it. Soon, he whispered. Once the creature's tongue passed between its jaws. Along the ceiling, the founder's voices traveled through the rock in softened fragments, too blurred for words, and the serpent lowered its head to listen. Rowena came to his chamber after midnight with a candle burned nearly to the socket. No knock preceded her. The latch lifted, the door opened, and she stepped inside, carrying the flame before her, as though entering a room she had once known well. Behind Salazar's desk, rain tapped against the shutters, light enough to sound like fingernails moving over wood. You missed supper, she said. I was not hungry. Helga waited. That was her choice. Godric did not. Salazar looked down at the page before him. 3 columns of runes and a narrow diagram of the chamber's final seal. From the doorway, the work might have passed for a set of drainage calculations, provided the reader did not come closer. The door closed behind her. His chamber had altered over the winter. Books packed into chests instead of lying open across the shelves. The green hanging taken down from beside the bed to leave a lighter patch on the wall. The silver basin Helga had given him, standing wrapped in cloth near the hearth. Rowena let her candle travel over each absence. You are leaving, she said. Eventually? When? When the school no longer requires me. That happened months ago, according to you. Salazar laid his quill beside the page. Then perhaps I've stayed from sentiment. You do not respect sentiment enough to blame it. I respect its usefulness. She crossed the chamber and set her candle upon the desk. Melted wax had run over her fingers and dried in pale ridges across the knuckles, and she had forgotten to pin her hair so it fell in a dark rope over one shoulder. We chose the house names. I expected you would. Godric argued for lions. How surprising. Helga wanted a badger. Less surprising. And I chose an eagle. You've always admired things that look down upon others. Her gaze held on him. We left the serpent for you. Salazar's hand moved once against the arm of his chair, thumb brushing the carved wood. thoughtful. Come tomorrow and accept it. Is that why you are here? No. The rain gathered briefly against the shutters and spilled from the sill outside. Somewhere lower in the tower, a door closed and a pupil hurried along the corridor, bare feet slapping stone before the sound disappeared. Rowena drew the false drainage plan towards her, and Salazar placed 2 fingers on its lower edge. "Do not," he said. "That is becoming your favorite word. It has served me well. With us, with everyone." Her eyes moved from his hand to his face. "Godric thinks you mean to force the matter of blood. Godric thinks every disagreement waits for a sword. He came without one today. So I noticed. He left it because he wanted you to know he was asking as a friend. Godric is clumsy with symbols. He is clumsy with many things that has never made him difficult to understand." Salazar released the parchment. Rowena did not lift it. Instead, she pressed her palm over the diagram, covering the runes beneath the pretense, and asked what lay below the eastern tower. "We have exhausted that subject. You have exhausted our patience. Then sleep." "I did for a little while. I dreamed the castle had a 5th voice." He studied her hand upon the page. A thread of candle smoke curled past her wrist and flattened beneath the low ceiling. What did it say? Nothing. It breathed under the floors. "That is not a voice." "No." She withdrew her hand, and the parchment came with it, caught by a bead of wax from her fingers. For one moment the lower edge lifted, revealing the tip of a second sheet beneath. A curve of ink, only that, a single scaled line, part of the serpent's carved root around the pillar. Rowena looked down. Salazar moved before she could separate the pages, laying his hand over hers and pressing both parchments flat against the desk. There was no violence in the gesture, though neither of them pretended it was gentle. "Let go," she said. "No." "Then I was right. You've been right about many irrelevant things. A serpent. A decorative plan. Beneath the foundations. For a column. There's no column beneath the eastern tower. Your surveys were incomplete." Her breath left slowly through her nose. "Still that. Still true." For several seconds, neither of them moved. Candlelight stood between their faces. Bright upon the wax hardened over her skin, and Salazar could feel the small bones of her hand beneath his palm and the faint pulse at her wrist. "You taught me that concealed architecture leaves pressure elsewhere," she said. "Every hidden room steals weight, space, or air from another. Every secret has a shape. Then you should know better than to push against one you cannot see." Her eyes sharpened. "Is it dangerous?" "To whom?" "The children." "No." The answer came too quickly, and they both heard it. Her hand shifted beneath his. "You should have lied." "I did." Something loosened in her expression at that. She looked past him towards the packed chests and the bare wall and the wrapped silver basin set beside the hearth, and asked how long. "Long enough," he told her. "Since before they opened the school?" "Yes." "Before they had laid the first stone?" To that Salazar said nothing at all. Rowena closed her eyes once. When she opened them, the edge had gone out of her voice. "We stood on that hill with 4 staffs in the mud and promised there would be no hidden master here." "There is no master." "Then what are you?" "The man who planned for what the rest of you refused to imagine." Children born to muggles? Enemies. You have begun using the same word for both. The rain softened. Water crept in under the shutter and drew a dark line down the wall. He lifted his hand from hers and she peeled the pages apart, though she did not look at the lower drawing. She only folded the false plan once, trapping the fragment of serpent inside, and set it back on the desk. Godric means to ask you to leave, she said. I know. Helga will oppose him. I will not. She gave him the second half without pause, the sacrifice completed and cleanly spoken. Salazar reached for the quill and squared it against the edge of the page. You came to warn me, he said. I came to see whether anything remained to warn. And? She took up her candle. Wax cracked across her knuckles as her fingers closed around it, and she told him that in the morning she would tell Godric the Eastern foundations must remain sealed. Do not mistake me. I am not protecting you. I am protecting the school from whatever opening those walls might release. You do not know there is anything to release. No, I know only that you would rather lose all three of us than let us see it. Her hand found the latch. Rowena. She stopped with her back to him. For a moment the old answer came close, an apology shaped carefully enough to preserve the chamber, a confidence trimmed to harmless dimensions, some shared memory offered like a key. He could have kept a portion of her friendship by surrendering a smaller truth. Instead, he dipped the quill into the ink. Close the door, he said. She did. By morning, the rain had washed the last frost from the eastern tower. Deep below it, a new stone eyelid sealed the chamber's inner passage, and behind that blind wall, the basilisk shifted through its coils without opening its eyes. They met in the great hall before dawn, while the pupils still slept, and the newly finished roof held the darkness close beneath its beams. 4 chairs had been drawn up around the founder's table, and only 3 were occupied when Salazar came in. Helga with both hands around a cup gone cold, Rowena with no parchment before her, Godric standing behind his chair, with his palms resting on its carved back. Salazar shut the doors behind him. You chose an early hour, he said. Godric glanced to the high windows, where the first gray light had begun to gather. There are things children should not have to overhear. They hear more than you suppose. Then we shall try not to add to it. A fire burned low in the nearest hearth. Out of habit, Helga had laid breakfast along the table. Dark bread, butter, a dish of stewed plums, 4 clean bowls, and nothing had been served. Salazar took his usual chair and told them to proceed. Godric stayed on his feet. His sword lay on a side table several yards off, its belt coiled neatly beside it, the distance chosen with care. We cannot continue as we are, he said. A rare point of agreement. Helga's fingers tightened on the cup. Must you begin there? It saves time. Time is not what we lack. Her voice held the faint roughness of a sleepless night. A strand of fair hair had come loose beside her cheek, and she tucked it back twice before letting it be. Salazar remembered her doing exactly that beside a campfire years earlier, while Godric tried to roast a rabbit, and Rowena insisted he was burning it for philosophical reasons. Rowena looked across the table. Tell us plainly whether you intend to stay. glanced at the unfinished crest carved into the chair backs. Lion, eagle, and badger had already been cut. His own showed only a curling line where the serpent's body would begin. That depends. On what? Godric asked. Whether Hogwarts remains a school worth preserving. Godric's hands came off the chair. There are children sleeping under this roof who crossed half the country to learn what they are. Some crossed from houses that would have burned us 2 generations ago. Children are not their houses. Blood carries more than a surname. Helga set down the cup, and a thin ring of cold wine marked the wood beneath it. There it is again, she said. You have heard it before. I had hoped to hear something else. I hoped you would remember who sat beside you when no one else would. You hoped I would become convenient. Salazar looked at her. The hurt was not in her words, which stayed soft. It was in the way she had folded her hands beneath the table so that no one could watch them move. I remember, he said, then behave as though memory has weight. Godric drew out his chair and sat. The movement was heavy, stripped of its usual impatience. We will admit, every magical child who needs teaching, that decision stands. You cannot make it without me. We already have. The hall gave back the last word in a faint echo. Salazar turned towards Rowena. She met his gaze and inclined her head once, without triumph. She looked older than she had the evening before, though the night had added only hours. You agreed? He said, I did. Despite your doubts. Because of them. Godric leaned forward. The school cannot remain balanced upon your willingness to threaten its future whenever we refuse you. I have threatened nothing. You have hidden something beneath it. Helga looked sharply at Rowena, but Rowena did not turn. Salazar rested one hand upon the table and said they had no proof. No, Godric said, we have your refusals. And that now satisfies you? It has to. The first line of sunrise reached the upper windows. Pale light crossed the rafters and touched the long rows of empty benches where pupils would soon gather for breakfast, and dust moved through it in slow, bright grains. Helga pushed the bread towards him. He looked at the loaf. You have not eaten, she said. Neither of you. I am not leaving. The words were almost lost beneath the fire's quiet settling. Godric looked down at the table. Rowena's hand closed around the edge of her chair. Salazar cut a slice of bread. For a little while none of them spoke. He spread butter across it with the same knife they had shared through the school's first winter. Its handle scorched from the night Godric dropped it into the hearth, and Helga had refused to replace it. At last, Godric drew a folded document from inside his robe and laid it before Salazar, 3 names signed at the bottom. You may remain, he said, if you open every sealed passage, surrender every private ward within the school, and accept the admission of Muggle-born pupils without condition. Salazar read the page once. And if I decline? Godric's eyes did not leave his face. You leave Hogwarts. Godric, Helga said, turning towards him. We agreed. We agreed to ask him. I have asked. You wrote the answer before he came. So did he. Salazar folded the document along its existing crease. The parchment made a dry, brittle sound. When? He asked. Godric swallowed. By sunset. That is unnecessary. I shall leave before noon. Salazar, Helga began, and her chair scraped the floor as she stood. No. Godric closed his eyes briefly. Rowena kept still, though her gaze dropped to the fourth bowl, waiting near the bread. You need time to gather your things, Helga said. There are pupils to speak to, arrangements to make. My things are gathered. Understanding came slowly across her face. She looked to the doors, then back to him. You knew? I planned? Of course you did. Salazar rose. He set the folded document beside the untouched plums and left the slice of bread on his plate with a single bite gone from it. Godric stood as well. You could accept. No. One word, one honest word, and this need not end here. Salazar fastened the top clasp of his robe. You have asked for obedience and dressed it as honesty. I have asked you to trust us. You have asked me to make trust unnecessary. Rowena's eyes closed for the length of a breath. It was Helga who moved, reaching across the table to catch Salazar's sleeve, and the gesture stopped him where argument would not have. Her grip was firm, the same grip that had hauled him from a flooded ford, dragged him back from a collapsing wall, held him upright through 3 days of fever. She had never once asked leave to keep him alive. Do not leave like this, she said. How would you prefer it? Badly, loudly. Say something cruel enough for Godric to shout. Let Rowena answer you. Break a chair if pride requires it. Her fingers tightened in the green cloth. Do not make yourself a ghost while you are still standing here. He looked down at her hand a moment. Then he worked loose the clasp she held and slipped his arm free of the sleeve, leaving the outer robe draped across her fingers, like something she'd been given to mend. Beneath it he wore plain black. The great hall doors opened at his touch. Morning lay cold and colorless across the entrance steps, the road beyond the grounds thinning away into mist. Behind him no chair broke, no sword left its table, and the doors closed before anyone thought to call his name. Before noon he carried the last chest from his chamber down to the eastern courtyard. Mist clung to the unfinished battlements and softened the towers into pale shapes above the hill. 2 horses waited by the gate, one saddled for riding, the other burdened with books and instruments and the few possessions he had chosen to keep. No pupils had been let outside, though faces watched from a dozen upper windows. Under the gatehouse arch stood Godric. He had put his sword back on, the belt sat crooked, fastened in haste, and his red cloak hung open over a shirt stripped of its usual leather guards. His eyes went to the chests, then the horses, then to Salazar. You meant it, he said. I generally do. I thought you might delay until sunset. Oh, you gave me until sunset. You did not require me to use it. Water dripped from the arch between them. A stable boy passed with a bundle of reins, and Godric shifted to let him by, then stepped back into the opening. Where will you go? Away from your admissions council. That was not my question. It is the answer you have earned. His mouth tightened. He looked towards the high windows, where the pupils stood pretending not to watch. Some of them will ask after you. Tell them I found the roof oppressive. They will know you better than that. Then tell them the truth. Which one? Salazar secured the final strap around the chest. The leather buckle was Godric's own work, made years earlier through a winter when neither of them could afford a saddler. One side of it remained slightly uneven, though it had never once broken. "You should choose carefully," Salazar said. Godric gave a breath through his nose. "You always make every answer sound like a warning. Perhaps you've become easier to warn." For a moment the arch held the two of them as it had once held their laughter, their shouted instructions, their arguments over the placing of stone. Godric lifted one hand, almost reaching for the saddle strap, then let it fall. "Helga is in the kitchens," he said. "She says she will not watch. She made provisions for your journey." Salazar glanced at the leather bag tied behind the saddle. Bread, hard cheese, and a flask lay packed within, each wrapped against the damp, and a small sprig of rosemary protruded from beneath the flap. "Rowena? In the tower. Measuring something? Perhaps." Godric rested one shoulder against the gate. "She told the masons never to open the eastern foundations." Salazar's hand stopped upon the buckle. "She said the lower stone had shifted beyond safe repair," Godric continued. "I do not believe her." "Then ask." "I did." "And?" "She told me some doors become more dangerous when curiosity is given a hammer." The faintest smile touched Salazar's mouth. "That sounds like her." "It sounds like you." Somewhere inside the castle, a bell rang, low and unfinished in tone. Lessons would begin within the quarter hour. Even now, with one founder leaving through the gate, Hogwarts went on demanding its timetables, its ink, its breakfast, and its warm rooms. Godric straightened. "Last chance." "To do what?" "Say that we are wrong." "You are." "Say why." "No." Anger crossed his face at last, clean and bright enough to belong to the man Salazar remembered. His hand closed around the hilt of his sword, though he did not draw it. "You would rather leave us with this?" he asked. "With what?" "Years of wondering whether we failed you, or merely trusted you too long." Salazar put one foot in the stirrup. "That question may improve the school." Godric laughed once, without amusement. "There you are." He mounted. The horse shifted beneath him, restless in the damp, and from the windows above came the muted scrape of pupils drawing back from the glass as Godric looked up. "Go then," he said. Salazar gathered the reins. "I intend to." The road from Hogwarts curved down through wet grass before losing itself among bare trees. He did not look back at the gate until the first turn, and when he did, Godric still stood beneath the arch. Smaller now, one hand raised against the rain that had begun to fall. By afternoon the castle had vanished behind the hill. He left the horses tethered in a copse before dusk and returned on foot, alone, by a path no map recorded. The entrance opened among black roots below the eastern slope, far beyond the windows and the builders' roads. Down he went without a light, guiding himself by touch and by the low serpentine murmurs that traveled up through the stone to meet him. The chamber accepted his voice. Wards folded into place behind him, layer upon layer, sealing the outer tunnel until earth and rock and magic carried no trace of any passage. At the iron grill, he stopped and spoke softly into the dark. A pale curve shifted beyond the bars, then came the whisper of scales dragging across the floor. "You will wait," Salazar said. The basilisk lowered its head. Its eyelids stayed shut, thick and colorless over the hidden eyes, and one coil settled about the base of the carved pillar. He completed the last charm upon the stone serpent above it, and the empty sockets filled with shadow. He left no lamp burning. Far overhead, candles appeared one by one in the windows of Hogwarts, warm against the rain. Beneath the eastern tower, behind a door, without seam or handle, the great serpent drew itself into a tighter circle, rested its head upon its own body, and became still. The founders would quarrel and part, and the name of the chamber would thin into a rumor told to frighten first years. None of them ever proved what lay beneath the stone. It waited there, coiled in the warm dark, patient as only old magic can be, while the castle above went on forgetting one quiet year at a time.